Hello, my name is Nicholas Dawson, and I am the Community Volunteer Ambassador here at Manzanar National Historic Site. Many of you know Manzanar. It was a camp during World War II that incarcerated over 11,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a story, the story of my people. Before Manzanar, before the towns, before the prospectors and the miners, there was one people, the Indigenous people. And that is where I am actually descended from. They were a nomadic people. They moved seasons, they moved up and down the valley. There's stories of them going to lakes north, there's then stories of going to the deserts south. During the 1850s and the 1800s, there was many people coming to America from different countries, from Europe, from Asia, all across the world, hundreds of thousands. Unaware of this was the indigenous in the Owens Valley. They had no idea how this would change their life. They weren't even listening to the majority of this. But they knew stories from over the mountains from other tribes that have experienced the rushes, the miners, the settlers. So they had an idea, but they didn't know the full scope of it. The indigenous at the time knew that this valley had space to share. They didn't use everything in the valley, so they were okay with the settlers and the ranchers and the cattle. But because they didn't understand that where one people go, more people come. So as people settled in and they got their cattle and the mines, they started to realize that the land that they once inhabited, the lush, green, plentiful lands, were slowly being depleted. The cattle were trampling the springs, eating the grass. Settlers diverted creeks, rivers from where they were at the time. And while the indigenous did number many, during the course of this, tensions rose because now they had no space to move. The game in the area and the mountains were getting killed because of this. There was no plant life for them to use. So they did the only thing they knew how, and at the time, they thought it was okay, was to hunt the cattle of the settlers and the ranchers. The indigenous weren't really thinking that they were stealing cattle, it was more so they could survive. So, of course, they defended their land. They drove them off, and they thought they were going to be a barbaric, savage people, not realizing that they were just starving and they needed food, water. As tensions rose, they rose all the way through the 1850s, the beginning of the 1860s. The Army came in and encamped what is now known as Fort Independence. Now, the Army was called in not to take down the indigenous. They were there to keep the peace. They were there to separate the tribes and the settlers. Because of pressure from the settlers and the miners, they were forced to take drastic measures. Because the indigenous were starving, they were offered food, they were offered shelter, a place to live at Fort Independence, unaware that they were being tricked. Once about 1,000 people showed up to Fort Independence in hopes for this food and shelter, the Army decided that they needed to remove them from the valley. In July of 1863, over 1,000 indigenous to the Owens Valley were marched to Fort Tejon, which is south of Bakersfield but north of Los Angeles. They were told they would be peacefully put there. There would be food, shelter, an entire reservation for them at Fort Tejon. But along the way, people were starved, beaten, and some of them raped. If they wandered off to find water, they would be killed. Along the way, a lot ended up running away and coming back to the valley, but most were not fortunate enough to do that. Out of 1,000 people who marched to Fort Tejon, only 850 showed up. When they got there, they were expected to work and provide labor for their own benefit and for the benefit of the government. Within a couple years of the indigenous arriving at Fort Tejon, the reservation was dissolved. While some returned back to their home, just as many others went into the Central Valley to find other homes and work there. But as the many who came back to their home in the valley, they realized much of their land has been corralled and fenced off by the ranchers in the area. So, with no option, they found work with the ranchers. While many ranchers and settlers exploited the indigenous for their labor, many realized that they knew how to make this valley prosper. Many of the women were domestic workers. A lot of the men built the housing, built the roads that came into this valley. One such rancher that realized the benefit of having the indigenous come back into the valley was the Shepherd Ranch. He understood that in order to prosper his ranch, he needed to bring indigenous to help him work. So, just west of his ranch, he made a camp of about 30 indigenous peoples. He provided labor and he had a workforce to help him with whatever he would need. Despite many indigenous that allowed themselves to be a workforce for the ranchers and the settlers, there were a lot who felt that they could provide better for themselves. The Indian schools weren't just for the valley or for California. They were all across the nation. They were in Canada. Around the early 1900s, LA was a fast-growing city. The population was far exceeding what resources could handle. And so, in an effort to help the growth of Los Angeles, water was diverted from the Owens Valley down into Los Angeles. In the 1930s, DWP created a document, multiple documents, called the Indian Problem. This was due to the fact that they wanted the indigenous off the creeks and off the waterbed. Decades later, the reservations are still there. I, myself, had grown up and was raised on the Lone Pine Reservation. And to this day, I still hear stories about these issues, the water rights issues, the Indian schools, the march. I tell this story now because my ancestors couldn't. The people who experienced this trauma cannot speak for themselves. And so, therefore, I feel obligated. In recent years, the National Park Service and Manzanar have done more to tell the story of my people and those of the indigenous peoples. Okay, that was good. Okay, and what else?